Everyone, my name is Frederik Möllers. This is Christoph Sorge. We'll be presenting some work on privacy challenges in quantified self apps. This is joint work of our research group together with Anna and Ronald Petrilic, the latter of who is working for the Commissioner for Data Protection in Baden-Württemberg. As for ourselves, we're an interdisciplinary research group located at the Faculty of Law, but also co-located with the CISPA at the Saarland University. So we're doing research in both law and legal areas and computer science as well. I guess all of you know what quantified self or live logging is. Maybe some of you also use some services like Runtastic or Fitbit, those new wristbands. It's generally about collecting data about yourself and then using that data to infer some information, for example, measure your fitness, your improvement, and so on. We can largely divide the data that you sample into these four categories. One is reports that you want to find out about your own. So, for example, how your fitness improves over time. There's data about multiple users, so you might be interested in how you compare to other people in terms of fitness. There is multidimensional data that you collect about yourself, so you might want to know how your eating habits influence your fitness. And then there is research, of course, where you want to look at data from large groups. So the questions that we asked ourselves were these four. How do QS services and privacy relate from a legal perspective, so rather theoretical, then in practice, what do the service providers actually do? From a user's perspective, so what do the users think of this? And then again, from the technology perspective. So for this paper, we focused on the data that was already collected and then sent to the service provider. So we didn't look at the security of the connection between your wristband and your smartphone, or between the smartphone and the service provider. But we also we only looked at the data once it has been sent to the service provider. What do they do with it? How do they handle the data? How do they process it? As for the legal situation, there are two things that we have to look at. One is the currently enforced European Data Protection Directive, which is not directly applicable, but it was transposed into national law by the member states. The general idea is that if you collect data and you want to process it, then, and it's personal data, this is only allowed under certain conditions. And it's applicable to all data that is being processed within the EU. And then the next big thing in terms of law is the GDPR, which I guess most of you have heard about, which is applicable from 2018, and the core principles are largely unchanged. So the idea that personal data is only allowed to be processed under certain conditions, that stays the same. But there are some terms that change, and then the interpretation of those terms is a little unclear because there's no court rulings that have clarified the meaning of those terms. It's applicable to all offerings of services or goods within the EU. So even if you have a company that's based in the US and they offer a service in the EU, then they still have to abide by those rules. There are significant fines for violations, so it goes up to 4% of the annual turnover of a company, and that would even hurt giants like Facebook or Google. So no matter what of those two you look at, the data processing for service provision, so if I provide a service for you, of course I have to process your data, and that is not usually a problem. When it comes to health data, then it's a little more restrictive, but still, if I provide a service for you, obviously I have to process your data. And if you give me your consent, then it's usually no problem at all. And we state that this is the rule that applies to most of the QS service providers. However, then the next problem is what are health data at all? What's the clear definition? For example, if I take my pulse, obviously that's related to my health. But if somebody collects location profiles and sees that I never run at speeds faster than 3 kph, then that might be related to my health as well. So it's a little unclear. Data related to third parties that I collect is a problem anyway. And yeah, data processing for other purposes than the one that I previously signed up for is usually problematic. So it's not generally allowed. There are some exceptions. If it's related to the original purpose or not incompatible with it, then this is allowed. But this is by far not a carte blanche for the service providers to do anything because it's not incompatible. And there's in the GDPR there's an explicit research exception, so data for research is allowed to be processed, and anonymous data is also rather unproblematic. However, even lawyers know now that if you strip the name of a data set, that data is not necessarily anonymous at that point, so it's not that easy for the service providers. So we looked at the practice, how do service providers handle the data that you give them, and there are some things that are rather intuitive. For example, most of the service providers store their data exclusively in the cloud, although you might argue that for some of their calculations it's not really necessary to store the data in the cloud, but then most of the services finance themselves by doing advertisements or doing personalized advertisements, which is rather common as well. If you look at the column next to the direct advertisement, then you see that some service providers explicitly state that in their privacy policies. Some only say, okay, we may contact you with relevant information about our services, which you can interpret as advertisement. And then we also found some very peculiar things in the privacy policies. For example, if you take a look at the last red circle, some service providers say, okay, we may change these privacy policies from time to time, and you have to check our website to be noticed to notice these changes. And I guess everyone who's read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy knows why this should be or will be a problem. I mean, if the service provider just changes their privacy policy, saying, okay, from today I may sell your data to the highest bidder, and well, you had 3 hours to check my website, so I did it. And if you want to sue me now, then it's your problem. You had time to check it. So this is clearly a problem. And then we had some other things, which you can see. But for more details, I have to refer you to the paper. And yeah, then we also did a survey, which will be presented by Christoph.
Yeah, so next thing we were interested in was the user perspective. Once again, we have a lot more results in the paper and on our hard drives, but some striking results. First of all, we asked for how sensitive users consider certain kinds of data, or in that case, all respondents of our survey, which was among about 400 people in the UK, so we were just in time for the EU perspective to cover the UK. The first question was how sensitive the data were considered, and I was quite astonished that financial assets, financial transactions, these data were considered very sensitive by a large percentage of people. Health data were below that, which I didn't expect, and also data like weight or muscle mass, which are related to your health, but are not usually called health data, or which people don't think of as health data, were not considered very sensitive. So some quite interesting results there. Next thing we wanted to know is what do they think could happen with the data, and are they willing to do something against it? First thing we asked was, are people willing to pay to prevent data transfers, and also are they even worried about data transfer? So concerning the worries about data transfers, 3/4 were worried about transfer of health data under their real identity, and then I found it quite remarkable that even under a random pseudonym, about half of the people would still consider that an issue. So people are obviously aware that taking pseudonyms is not real anonymization, and I found that quite positive. So it's even known outside our community that pseudonyms aren't sufficient necessarily. When it comes to paying for privacy, well, at least 30% said they would pay a one-off fee. We didn't specify the height of the fee, but 30% would pay a one-off fee to prevent data transfers of health data. 21% would even be willing to pay a monthly fee. So, of course, we don't know how high that fee could be. More or less funny result concerning reading privacy policies, which you can interpret in two different ways. We asked potential users, so people who don't use QS services, would you read the privacy policies prior to starting to use a service? And many of them said, yes, I would. When we asked people who actually used the services, many said no, but a large percentage refused to give an answer. So that's what you see down there. That's people who used the services who refused to answer if they read the privacy policies. There are different ways to interpret that. Another example for a result here is, would you use a quantified self-service that finances itself by transferring your data to third parties? 85% said no, 9% said yes. Obviously, we did the study of the privacy policies and we asked users, so what's more obvious than combining those two? So do people expect that, for example, here, these different service providers use the data for personalized advertisement? So, for example, we had 32 users of Runtastic in the survey. 2/3 of them said we don't expect personalized advertisement, and also about 2/3 said if Runtastic was using my data for personalized advertisement, we would stop using that service, which is quite remarkable because Runtastic does that. At least they said it in the privacy policy. Okay. Now, coming from the user perspective to the pet perspective, and that obviously we can't give you the solutions for privacy in the QS, so it's just an overview of possible research issues we see there. The first one, going from one to multiple users, like you want competition. Alice wants to compare her running speed to Bob. Well, there is a simple solution in a simple setting. That's Yao's millionaire problem, and a lot of solutions for that. But for example, if you want to know how much did Alice improve in comparison to Bob, then it gets more difficult. And you can think of further examples in that direction. If you have multidimensional data, especially if it's also about multiple users, you have to look, can the goals of my application still be achieved if I use fuzzy or aggregated data? Does aggregation of data help? You can do aggregation for one-dimensional data. Of course, you can do it several times for each dimension, but if you want to look at the relation between these data, then it gets obviously difficult, and that's application dependent. Then next challenge we were thinking about is time series data. So if you have data from different periods, can you make them unlinkable? So you have two persons, one has a pulse of 60 in the first period, and the other has a pulse of 140, and you see that in the second period there's one with a pulse of 65 and one with a pulse of 130. Can you map them? So there is no obvious solution for that. It gets more difficult if you want to use data for research, so you don't know the analysis goal beforehand. You are looking for unknown correlations. And can you do that with anonymous data? Obviously, not very simple. We, as an interdisciplinary working group, are especially interested in the intersection between legal and technical issues. So are data sufficiently anonymized from the perspective of the GDPR? And that's something that we are going to do also in collaboration with other researchers. So to conclude, we have a lot of data which can be considered very sensitive, especially by the law, as they include health data. But we don't even know what health data are from the legal perspective, so we have to find the clear delineation. When it's data coming from a hospital, it seems quite clear, but we heard that question yesterday, what about my Fitbit data or stuff like that? Users might not always be aware of the consequences, and even if they are, even if they state their preferences, we would like to have privacy, they don't always act accordingly, and we saw that. We also saw that there is a mismatch between the user expectations and the actual policies of the service providers. That fantastic example, for example, with personalized advertisement. So to conclude, we don't have that one solution, but we have a lot of work to do for the upcoming pads, and we hope to come back in the next few years with some more solutions from the technical perspective. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.